So tonight, we are going to be talking about Buddhism. And when Travis asked me to fill in for him, he said, "What do you think about Buddhism?" I said, "What do you mean, what do I think?" He's like, "Well, do you think you could teach it?" I said, "Absolutely. I love Buddhism. And the reason is, it's extremely simple. By the time we get done tonight, I guarantee that each one of you could leave this room and become a Buddhist. You could think like a Buddhist. You could act like a Buddhist. And through a lot of hard work and meditation, you could become a Buddhist. But it's very simple. And to understand Buddhism, we start with its founder. Unlike Hinduism, which we just discussed, Buddhism actually has a definitive start. We know exactly who started Buddhism. We know more or less when. And to some extent, we know how. Buddhism started with a guy by the name of Siddhartha. Siddhartha was of the Gautama clan, and Siddhartha lived in what we know to be eastern India. Eastern India, maybe the Nepal region. We're not exactly sure. There's a particular village that is often thought of to be Siddhartha's home, but no one's really positively certain exactly where he lived. We do know a little bit about his upbringing. He was the son of a king. He grew up in royalty. And being the son of a king, this king wanted to protect Siddhartha from certain things. He didn't want Siddhartha to see all the bad things in the world. And there were 4 things in particular that this king, this father of Siddhartha, did not want him to see. The first was a dead body. He didn't want him to know what death was. How many of you would wish that your parents had protected you from that in some way? You know, how many of you had a pet die? My niece's guinea pig died last weekend. That was a sad thing. But Siddhartha's dad protected him from that, wanted to keep him from seeing a dead body. The second thing is an aged or an old person. Now, some of you are thinking, I look in the mirror every day. You know, there's no protecting from that. And you would think that Siddhartha's dad wasn't dumb enough to think, oh, I'm going to be old one day and he can't look at me, but he protected him from seeing an old person. Now, old is relative, of course. Some people look at me and see that I'm old. Some of you are looking at me and saying, old? No. The third, a diseased or sick person. Siddhartha's father protected him from seeing overly sick people. And then the fourth was an ascetic monk. More specifically, he kept him from seeing a poor person. I guess I should say more generally. Kept him from seeing a poor person. He did not want him to see poverty. So there's 4 things he didn't want him to see. He didn't want him to see death. Didn't want him to see old age. Didn't want him to see sickness. And didn't want him to see poverty. Now, as a king, and as the son of a king, that was very easy. Siddhartha's dad said, you don't leave, you stay here. And Siddhartha did. Siddhartha lived a good portion of his life in that sort of setting until about the age of 19. He got married, had a son, things started going good. Then at age 30, he left the walls. We're not exactly sure why. There's conflicting opinions as to how. One says that he snuck out one day, that he said, enough of this. I'm going to go see what's out there. I'm going to go see the world. He waited till age 30. We kick our kids out of the house at what, 18, 17, 13? It just kind of depends. He finally decided, I'm going to go see what's out there. Now, one account says he snuck out. Second account says that his father let him go, but made sure that in the village he had removed all these things he didn't want Siddhartha to see. Either way, Siddhartha did actually see the 4 things that his father protected him from. He saw an old person. He saw a sick person. He saw a funeral procession. And he saw a poor monk. And Siddhartha realized at age 30 that life wasn't all it was cracked up to be. You see, he had lived his entire life without knowing that all of this bad stuff had happened. He had only seen the good. He had seen the lavish riches. He had seen the good health care. He had seen all the good skin regimens that made you not, go old and wrinkled and gray and whatever. He had never seen any of this. And he gets outside these walls, and all of a sudden he realizes, I've never seen what the world really is. And it confused him. You see, Siddhartha grew up in this household under some form of Hinduism. This region being part of India, he was raised under part of Hinduism. And he realized that the way he had been brought up kept him from seeing the way the world really was. So he set out to make some sense of it. He left his family, he left his home, he left his wife and his son, and he set out on a quest for life's meaning. He wanted to search for what he called enlightenment. Enlightenment to Siddhartha meant, I want to make sense of this. I want to not be in the dark anymore. He was held in the dark for so long, protected from all of these things, and he said, I want to see the world for what it really is. So he tried a few different methods. First, he sought out a guru. I don't remember if we discussed gurus much in the Hinduism chapter, but a guru is essentially a learned person. This was someone who was very wise, had figured out a lot of life, and spent the rest of their life teaching others what they had learned. So Siddhartha said, well, if somebody else has been out there and has figured out a lot of this stuff, I'm going to go and learn from this person. So he tried that. Apparently, he disagreed with this guru because he didn't stay with him for very long. He eventually tried another path. He said, well, if the guru's not going to do any good, he said, I'm going to try something else. He decided to try what's called asceticism, extreme asceticism. Now, asceticism basically means that he deprived himself of almost everything. He would be dressed very simply in a very plain robe. He would eat very little. He probably didn't have a house or any possessions of his own. He gave up everything and tried to live in such a way in which case he needed nothing. In fact, some stories even say that for a point he attempted to live off of a single grain of rice a day. A single grain, grain. Some of you would drop a grain on the floor and you couldn't even find it. He lived off of that for a period of time, or at least they say. And then that didn't work. So then he decided, well, I might as well try and meditate. In fact, he was kind of prompted by some former friends of his. He was joining them for a meal at a tavern one night and basically asked him what the heck was he doing. You're starving yourself. It makes no sense. You're not even happy. And Siddhartha realizes, oops, this was not what I was looking for. So he leaves the tavern. He goes and finds a fig tree, which is commonly known in the Buddhism tradition as the Bodhi tree. And he decides to sit and meditate until he figures out this thing called life. Now, in Hinduism, the classic meditation position is the lotus position. When I took world religions in college, my professor, my 65-year-old professor, got on top of his desk and folded himself into the lotus position and said, this is what Siddhartha did. And he did. He sat under that tree in the lotus position. Accounts vary. He may have sat there for a day or two. He may have sat there for a few weeks or a few months, maybe even a year. We really don't know. But either way, when Siddhartha finally figured out how to uncross his legs, he had gotten some answers. Some things had popped into his head, and he said, I get it now. This makes sense. And he had achieved what he sought out to achieve. Now, these are some of the things that he figured out. Life is an endless cycle of birth, life, and death. Things are born, things are created, they live for a time, and then they die. That's true for all things. He never saw an exception to that. And in that time under the tree, he realized that. B, this cycle creates desire that causes karma and places burdens on people. Karma was a Hindu tradition that he held on to. He understood the desires that he had caused him to want to act in a certain way. Remember, that's what karma is. Third, enlightenment would only come when he figured out how to overcome that desire. He realized that if desire was what caused him his pain, then if he overcame his desire, then he would no longer have pain. He would reach that level that he was looking for, that level of enlightenment, that it all made sense, that he was happy in. And then fourth, he later became known as the Buddha, because Buddha means enlightened one. This was a term that he actually went around calling himself. He realized that he had reached a state that he had sought to that other people had not attained as of yet. And so he started calling himself Buddha. Buddha means enlightened one. Then after he realized this, he went back and found those 5 friends that he had met in that tavern that had said, "What are you doing, you crazy person? You are killing yourself for no good reason." And said, "Thank you, I have figured it out." He found those 5 friends and preached to him the things that he figured out underneath that Bodhi tree. All these things that he had figured out in his mind, he went and shared with them. He realized that neither extreme indulgence nor extreme deprivation would bring his enlightenment. He tried that. He had lived a life of indulgence for most of his time. He tried to go out and seek all the things, all the answers that he wanted. That didn't work. So then he tried to deprive himself of everything and realized that didn't work. So he decided that one must find a middle way. That's what he preached to these 5 friends. Find the middle way. Come with me and we will find the middle way. Not too far this way, not too far that way, because both have their problems. We're going to find the happy medium. And that's really what Siddhartha was looking for. He was looking for happiness. He didn't want sadness. See, when he had left those walls after living this sheltered life, all these things that he saw made him sad. And so he was searching for happiness. And he realized that this middle way would find him. These 5 men joined Siddhartha to form the first Buddhist monastery. And he and these 5 friends spent the rest of their lives meditating and coming up with this middle way, learning what that meant. And then they started teaching others that as well. So that's the story of Siddhartha. That's where all of this started. That's where all of this began. And unlike Hinduism, we can trace it all the way back. We can say this makes sense. And because of this, we actually know quite a bit of what Buddhists believe, because while there's many different interpretations, there's always this central idea. Some of the basic beliefs started with Hinduism. Siddhartha understood life through a Hindu's lens. He lived as a Hindu for the first 30 years of his life or so. He understood some of the teachings. He knew the gods. He knew the behavioral practices. He knew the worship practices. He knew all of the things of Hinduism. But he realized that while that was there, it wasn't all correct. So he started to adapt it. He adapted certain Hindu beliefs. First, he stopped all animal sacrifices. Now, animal sacrifices are not a centerpiece of Hinduism, but there are certain rituals to certain gods in certain areas of Hinduism that allow for for sacrifices, for animal sacrifices. Now, remember, we talked about how the Hindus believe that there is a spirit in all things, there's a soul in all things. Travis talked about the family across the street that have these big trees, and they really think that these trees are helping protect the house, but they also have a soul and is living in them. Well, because there's such a wide range of Hindu beliefs, there were certain ones that did believe that animal sacrifices were acceptable for worshiping certain gods. There's many different interpretations as to what exactly the reasoning behind it was, but either way, Siddhartha said, no more. The second thing is he realized gods, the Hindu gods, were really irrelevant. They didn't mean anything. They weren't really teaching anybody anything. They weren't showing anybody the right way. In fact, as best he could tell, they were pretty much useless. They were useless idols. Amen. He realized something that the Hindus didn't. He said, these things aren't going to take you anywhere. Now, he did think that they were good for a center of meditation, that they had good stories behind them. But as far as the point of reaching enlightenment, he said they were pointless. He taught indifference to them, and they were of no use for finding enlightenment. Now, if you turn the page, this is where we see the center of all Buddhist beliefs. All Buddhist belief can be summed up in these 4 noble truths. Now, they're called noble truths because noble, they make the one who understands them noble, of a higher existence. And truth, because corresponding to reality, they are truth. Siddhartha really believed that there was nothing that could refute these 4 things. Remember, these are all things that came to his mind sitting under the Bodhi tree. But he thought that there was nothing that could refute these 4 things. The first truth is the noble truth of pain. More eloquently, to live is to suffer. To do otherwise is impossible. Now you think, that kind of makes sense to me, kind of not. Let me ask you something. When you woke up this morning, what was the first thing that came to your mind? I guarantee you it was either, I got to get to the bathroom, geez, I'm hungry, or why are my kids awake at this moment? Either way, these are not happy thoughts at whatever time you woke up in the morning, correct? They're things that need to be fulfilled. Otherwise, there's going to be problems. You need to go to the bathroom, or you're going to have to change the sheets. You need to eat, or your stomach is going to eat itself, or you need to figure out what you can do to calm those kids down, or they're going to cause me to rip my hair out. Some of you are thinking, yep, that was me. All 3 this morning. There are 2 ways to suffer. One is physically. Hunger is a physical suffering. Sickness is a physical suffering. The second is psychologically. This would come from sadness. This would come from maybe a separation anxiety idea, frustration. These are all psychological pains. Now, with that in mind comes noble truth number 2, the truth of the cause of that pain. We've already kind of talked about this, but Siddhartha realized that the cause of pain, suffering, was caused by cravings or desires or wants. You got it this morning, you were hungry. Why? You wanted food. Your body wanted food. You got up this morning, you were angry because your 3-year-old was running around the house at 5 o'clock in the morning. And why was that a problem? Because you wanted more sleep. All pain is caused by cravings, desires, or wants. Getting what we want is no guarantee of happiness. I go back to the analogy of hunger. You eat at 6 o'clock in the morning, by 8 or 9, what happens? You're hungry again. You were happy for a time, but not for long. I know if I eat at 6 in the morning, by at least 10 o'clock, I'm searching for a granola bar or something. You know, it only lasts for a little while. But because of this, humans need to modify their wantings. On Wednesday, we were wrapping up the gathering, and we asked the church to join us in a time of fasting. And Siddhartha would have had no problem with that, because Siddhartha realized that if hunger causes me pain, then I need to want something other than food. Now, the Christian idea of that is if we don't want food, we want more of God. So Travis would say that if you get hungry while fasting, you need to go pray or read your Bible or ask God to fill you with Him instead of with food. Siddhartha would say you just need to forget about it. Just give it up food. Just don't even think about it. Go think of something else. Go meditate on something else. Either way, you need to modify your wantings. Now, because of Noble Truth 1 and Noble Truth 2, Noble Truth 3 comes along. The noble truth that suffering may be overcome and happiness attained. So how do we do that? You must learn to give up useless cravings and learn to live each day without restlessness or selfishness, enduring life's difficulties without hatred or anger. Easier said than done, correct? Sum it up this way. Siddhartha realized that the way to get rid of pain was to get rid of cravings. If I don't crave, if I don't desire, if I don't want, I'll have no pain. So the Noble Truth 3 is A plus B equals C. If to live is to suffer and pain is caused by desire, then I can get over my pain by getting over my desire. Does that make sense? Are you following me? Okay, this is the natural progression that he followed. This is all coming from his mind sitting under the Bodhi tree. Suffering is made a state of mind. Happiness becomes a state of being. Siddhartha realized, sitting under the Bodhi tree, that all of his desires came from within. He realized that everything that he wanted, everything that he craved, everything that he desired was not pressed on him by any other person. It was manifested itself within himself. It was a state of mind. He could get over his state of mind. How? By reaching happiness, which was a state of being. He realized that happiness was not necessarily in the mind. Happiness was all over. Have you ever been so happy that you just couldn't stand still? That was Siddhartha's idea. It was a state of being. He became to realize that happiness was going to change not just the way he thought, but it was going to change everything about him. And that's what he wanted to reach. With these realizations, nirvana is achieved. Nirvana is the Buddhist end goal. This is where they want to get. Christianity, the goal of Christianity, most people would say the goal of Christianity is to get to heaven. The goal of Judaism is to get to heaven. The goal of Hinduism is to get off of the cycle. The goal of atheism is to disprove everything else. The goal of Buddhism is to reach nirvana. Nirvana is a dimension transcending time and space where there is no movement, aging, or dying. This was not somewhere where you went. This was not a place where you continued to be who you were just in another dimension. This was not a heaven. This was not another planet or another place. It was a state of being. This was more, again, in the mind. Buddhism is all in the mind. It's all in their heads. But that's the truth. That's where it all originated, and that's where it all stayed. 2, it is infinite, eternal, and without causation. Because it really doesn't exist. It is not a place or anything. Nirvana really has no beginning. It has no end. It just is. There are no boundaries and no concepts of self or non-self. When you reach nirvana, you've basically lost all identity of who you are. You don't think of yourself anymore. Really, you don't think of yourself at all or not at all. You just kind of are. It really makes no sense, but nirvana basically removes all of these things that are running through your mind right now. Imagine that. Every little thought that you have right now would not exist in nirvana. Not, what was that last blank? What is he talking about? Not, gosh, my hand itches. Or where are we going to eat later? None of these thoughts would exist in nirvana. They just go away. And it is an experience, not a place, of great happiness. This was the goal that Siddhartha wanted to reach. He wanted to reach happiness. He realized very early on that the privileged life that he was living didn't make him happy. That's when he snuck out of the walls. But then he saw all the things that his father had tried to protect him from and realized that that didn't make him happy either. So he tried to learn some things about it. That didn't make him happy. He had tried to remove everything from his life. That didn't make him happy. So he went and sat under the tree until he realized what would make him happy. And that was reaching this point of nirvana, enlightenment. And then that leads us to the fourth noble truth, the noble truth of the way that leads to cessation. Cessation is the getting rid of desire. Noble truth number 1, to live is to suffer. Noble truth number 2, suffering is caused by desire. Number 3, suffering can be overcome by eliminating desire. And number 4, that is done in this way, the Eightfold Path. Almost all practical belief of Buddhism are summed up in these 8 things. The first is the right views, the perfect understanding of the truth of existence. You cannot believe noble truth number 4 if you don't believe 1, 2, and 3. 4 becomes irrelevant. So to have the right views is to believe truths 1, 2, and 3, and of course 4, otherwise you wouldn't be here at the first of the Eightfold Path. Second is the right intention, the willingness to achieve enlightenment. This is saying that the point of life, the point of your life, is not to get, to gain, or to lose, or forsake. The point of your life is to reach enlightenment. That is the right intention. These two form a subgroup within the 8, which would be the right wisdom. If you want to make a note out to the side, these are the wisdom of the Eightfold Path. The next one is right speech, saying all that is required, or nothing more. When you were growing up, you probably heard this phrase: if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Or children are meant to be seen and not heard. Siddhartha believed all of that. He said that you are to say all that is required, but nothing more. No excess. No funny little anecdotes. Don't be offering your opinion if no one asks it. Don't even say good morning to somebody if nobody says it to you first. Say all that is required and nothing more. This also encompasses don't lie, don't curse, no excessive language. Don't say anything that isn't necessarily needed to be said. Number 4 is the right action, doing all that was required and nothing more. Remember, to do more than what is required would center around desire. To say, it is necessary for me to get up in the morning. I'm hungry, therefore it's necessary for me to eat. However, is it necessary for you to eat that second bowl of cereal? No. The first one's sufficient. For Siddhartha, for a time during his asceticism, 1 grain of rice was sufficient. That was all the action that was required to meet his needs. That was all that needed to be done. Next is the right livelihood, being a monk or a nun. By the way, those of you who are grammar Nazis, it's N-U-N, not N-O-N in your books. I caught that. There are certain teachings in Buddhism that actually make exceptions for this rule. The right livelihood in this case can mean any sort of livelihood that doesn't forsake any other part of the teaching of Buddhism. It's hard to do that without being a monk or a nun. It's hard to imagine yourself in a position that did not cater to your own wants or desires or somebody else's wants or desires. Imagine working in a fast food restaurant and saying to the person driving through the drive-through line instead of, would you like that supersized? Are you sure you don't want the value burger and fries? You know, that just doesn't work, right? That you'd get fired pretty quickly. Buddhism realizes that, or Siddhartha realizes that. Of course, he didn't have drive-thrus in that time, but he realized that sort of a thing and said, that's not going to work. You've got to devote your life to reaching nirvana on this eightfold path, and anything that would take you away from that is not a right livelihood. You have to live in the right way. The next is right effort, directing one's efforts properly. You got to do everything for the right reason. There's no such thing as useless movement or useless action or useless anything in Buddhism. Lisa Emily, how did you get here tonight? How far?
3 miles.
Do you have a car?
Yes.
Why did you ride your bike?
Because I wanted to exercise.
Okay. Was that proper effort? Was that effort necessary? Or was it because of a desire?
Right.
It was a desire. Now, how many of you drove less than 1 mile to get here tonight? Why? Why did you drive?
It was the fastest way to get here.
Okay. And you got here
30 minutes late.
Some would say that's absolutely necessary. Siddhartha would say no. Siddhartha would say, make your effort to get there on time and to do it in the proper manner. The next is the right mindfulness, meditating properly. You have to keep the right head about you. How many of you have looked at your teenagers lately and said, what were you thinking? And you know the answer to that. The answer is, they weren't. I still do that every now and then. It's like, what was I thinking? Oh, wait, I didn't. Siddhartha said there's no place for that. Everything has to have the right thinking behind it. Meditate on everything. Remember, all of this came from a period of meditation, intense meditation, where he sat down with a question and said, I'm not leaving this place until I get the answer. Have any of you ever been in that place in your life? You probably didn't get where Siddhartha went. But he's saying that in life, meditation is absolutely necessary. It's absolutely necessary to get your mind in the right place. And the last is the right concentration, maintaining continual focus. It's really just an extension of the one before. Don't do anything haphazardly. Siddhartha did not believe in spur-of-the-moment decisions. Siddhartha did not believe in reckless decisions. Siddhartha said, you must always have your right head about you through meditation and through not. Always have the right mind about you. In Buddhist thinking, everything needed for a good and proper existence is encapsulated in the Eightfold Path. If you could properly perform all 8 of these things, if you had all of these right things in your life, Buddhists believe, if done perfectly, you will reach enlightenment or nirvana. Now, how do they teach that to people today? The Buddha's not around anymore. He died in around 480 to 400 BC, depending on whose account of this you believe. They do have scriptures. The main scripture of Buddhism is the Tripitaka. Tripitaka means 3 baskets. Now, there's more than 3 books. There's a whole bunch of them, a multi-volume set of books. But each book is grouped into 3 parts. If you turn the page, these 3 parts are first, the teachings of the Buddha. Now, these were not written by Buddha. These were written by people much later. These were just teachings attributed to him. If you remember when we talked about Hinduism, the scriptures were not written immediately. They were collected over a period of time based on a series of oral teachings. We mentioned earlier in our introduction that in Islam, the scriptures were not written immediately, that they were verbally taught for a period of time before somebody finally said, ooh, that's good, we better write that down before we forget. In Buddhism, it's the same thing. So they started with the teachings of Buddha. Then they said, well, Buddha's not the only smart person that ever lived. There's been a few since. So anything that didn't disagree with the Buddha but was good teaching, they included teachings and sermons by others. And then they also included, with some of the topical things, some commentary. They said that, oh, well, this is good and useful. The books were not completed until 100 BC in Sri Lanka. Now, if you know anything about Sri Lanka is a small island off the end of India. And as far as we know, Siddhartha Gautama, the original Buddha, never went there. So at this point, his teachings, his oral traditions, have been carried at least 300 years and across water to where they were finally written down, sort of separate from Hinduism. It's kind of noteworthy to see that they were not written in India or in an area where Hinduism was very prominent. Sri Lanka had some Hinduism in it, but it was still a little bit separate. It's always been sort of a separate thing. This is where the Buddhism scriptures were written. Now, Buddhists do not hold these volumes as divine or infallible. See, Buddha's not a god. These writings didn't come from a god's teaching. These writings came from a smart man, from smart men who had figured out a lot of things. But because of that idea, they're viewed as teachings of a great man or great men that should be judged against one's own experience. If what you know, what you realize, things that make sense in your mind, if they don't contradict the basic teachings of Buddhism, but they contradict some of the secondary teachings, some of the other things that are taught in the Tripitaka, that's okay. Now, imagine if we read the Bible like that. There are certain parts of that some people look at today and say, gosh, that's really not relevant in the 21st century now, is it? We're different people now. Things are acceptable now that weren't acceptable then. Yeah, we can fudge that line for a little while before all hell breaks loose. In Buddhism, it's not like that. Buddhism says if it makes sense in your mind, makes sense to me. That works. Okay, let's go with it. So they don't really look at their scriptures as being necessary. Now, they do study them. Monks study the scriptures. Why? Because they are good teachings. They are going to get you where you need to go, or at least help you get there. They may not get you all the way there. You're going to have to put some of your own thoughts and some of your own actions into it. But they're going to help you get there. Now, beyond the Four Noble Truths, there are certain concepts that the Buddhists also believe. These are concepts of morality. Some would say that the Buddhists are the most moral. And if you look at the Eightfold Path, you can kind of see why. Everything is very intentional. Everything is meant to preserve life, not to destroy it, both your own and others. Everything is meant to happen in the most perfect way. So they really have a lot of basic ideas of morality that we would agree with, that just about anybody would agree with, but it goes further than that even. As far as Buddhists go, the Buddhist concept of morality is all speech and or actions rooted in greed, hatred, or delusion lead away from nirvana and is therefore bad. Greed stems from what? Desire. The point of Buddhism is to do what? Eliminate that desire. So to do something out of greed is bad. Hatred is also rooted in desire. So is delusion. Of course, if you're delusional, you don't exactly see it, but it's there. Ethics based on self-understanding are stronger than ethics based on command. Buddhists don't believe in commandments. Now, they do believe in the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and we're going to see in a second some precepts. But these are, to them, common sense things. These are not things that somebody else said, you have to do this. Somebody else said, this is just the way it is. So they don't believe in commandments because they think that commandments, to follow commandments, stem from a desire, from a sense of duty. And a sense of duty is desire. Or they can be followed by a sense of fear. Either way, you follow commandments based on what? Desire. Buddhism seeks to get rid of desire. So in a Buddhist's mind, if it makes sense to me, that's more important than what you tell me to do. That can be misconstrued. So they say, well, wait a second, there's some things that obviously should make sense to everybody. Obviously, they don't. Here's the 5 precepts. These are the 5 moral precepts that all Buddhists should follow. First, avoid killing or harming living beings. Now, this isn't just people. This also includes animals, all animals. How many of you have been deer hunting already? You wouldn't if you were a Buddhist. How many of you have killed a cockroach in the last week? You wouldn't if you were a Buddhist. Now, they go even further. Living beings aren't just animals, aren't just insects, aren't just people. Living beings are also plants. If you were a Buddhist, you wouldn't cut your grass, because that would be doing hard to a living being. In fact, most Buddhists are very strict vegetarians, and they'll only eat certain foods. They will only eat certain foods. The foods that they will eat will not harm or kill the plants that they eat. In fact, most Buddhists eat rice because the harvesting of rice does not require you to harm or destroy the plant. If done properly, rice harvest produces a crop that will come back next year and next year and next year. There's no replanting because the plant survives. So they mostly live, if you're a good Buddhist monk, you mostly live off rice. They'll eat other things, but they are very certain that the foods that they eat do not harm the plants that they're taken from, which does mean certain vegetables. They wouldn't eat leafy greens because a leafy green is the plant itself. To eat it is to kill it. They'd eat an apple, because to take that off of a tree really doesn't harm it. They probably wouldn't eat broccoli. If there's any kids listening, they're probably thinking, I'm a Buddhist right now. But they will only eat certain foods that will not harm the plant to eat. The second one is to avoid stealing. Stealing, why would you ever steal if you didn't have a desire? Stealing roots in desire. C is avoid sexual misconduct. To a point, Buddhists will follow this almost to the fullest degree of celibacy. A monk would never take a wife because sexual desire is present in order for there to be a sexual activity. So to eliminate that desire, they eliminate the activity. Good luck. D, avoid lying. This goes back to the right speech. Why would you lie? The only reason you would lie is for self-preservation. The only reason you would lie for self-preservation is rooted in what? Desire. That's the Sunday school answer today, by the way, if you haven't figured that out. And then the last one, avoid alcohol or other intoxicating drugs. The reason is they believe it produces a false nirvana. It takes you to a place without suffering that isn't really true. It's a cop-out. Now, if you were a true Buddhist monk, in certain teachings, this is not in your book, by the way, I'll try and go slow at this point. There are 5 other things that you might also follow. The first is avoid excessive eating. We talked earlier about food being a necessity, but to do it in excess was wrong. For the Buddhist monk, that is very true. In fact, most Buddhist monks, they don't grow their own food. They don't work. They spend most of their day sitting by the road with a bowl in their lap meditating. And it is the tradition in these areas that people would come by and drop grains of rice in this bowl. Not cooked grains, raw grains. They would drop grains of rice. Now, some people might come by and pull a whole handful out. But if you've got 20 monks in a row and all you've got is a bag of rice to feed your family for a month, you're not about to go pour it down the line. So they'll go and they'll drop a few grains here and a few grains there and just hope that the next person in line at the market is going to do the same thing. And then the monk will go home and prepare whatever food they have. And that'll be their food for the day. The second is avoid entertainment. If you were here before we started, on the screen you saw several pictures associated with Buddhism. One of the ones, I think it was in this lower left-hand corner, was about 3 or 4 Buddhist monks in yellow garb with red sash on a roller coaster. That wouldn't happen. That's entertainment. Entertainment is rooted in desire. They want to avoid that. Avoid personal adornments. You wouldn't wear jewelry. You wouldn't wear fancy clothing. No earrings, no necklaces. You would wear a plain robe and utilitarian sandals. That would be your dress for the day. This was one that was interesting that I found out. Avoid large beds. Specifically, the Buddhist tradition is excessively high or excessively wide beds. Most Buddhist monks would sleep on a slender mat smaller than a sleeping bag on the floor for that reason. It almost takes it to the point of asceticism, of extreme deprivation. And then the last one is avoid silver or gold. This is one that we can identify with. Our Bible, in fact, teaches the root of all evil is money. And a Buddhist monk realizes that. They say, we don't want anything to do with it. Just keep it away. It's either going to cause greed, want us to have more because it's worth a lot, or it's pretty. Either way, it's a desire, and they don't want anything to do with it. Now, the Buddhists do believe in a theory of rebirth, like the Hindus with reincarnation, but it's a little different with Buddhists. Buddhists believe that until nirvana is achieved, the mind, with its preferences and abilities at the time of death, reestablishes itself in a fertilized egg to live again. One of the ideas of Buddhism is that all existence takes place in the mind. They don't believe in a soul. They don't believe in a spirit. But they do believe in the mind. And at the end of death, or at the end of life, at the point of death, if you have not reached the point of nirvana, then your mind will be planted in a fertilized egg in a woman's womb, and you'll be reborn to get further along the path this time. It's a little different in reincarnation. In reincarnation, in Hindu idea of reincarnation, the way that you're reincarnated, it depends on how you lived, and you can come back as a person along whichever of the caste systems, or you could come back as maybe a banana slug. Buddhists don't believe that. If you're a human today, you will be a human in your next life until you reach nirvana. They do not believe that you can be reincarnated into anything except a human. If you follow a little bit of Far Eastern history and news, one of the most prominent figures in the Far East is the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is Buddhist. That is a Buddhist tradition that follows him. They believe that the Dalai Lama today has been the Dalai Lama always. That this person, the spiritual leader of this Buddhist tradition, is a reincarnation of the previous Dalai Lama. Interestingly enough, I read this the other day, the current Dalai Lama has said that he is probably the last one. Kind of a bold statement. However, he has not said it's because he feels like he's reaching nirvana. He says he thinks that he's the last Dalai Lama because he doesn't think the world needs one anymore. Just a side note. Do with it what you will. So all the fundamental beliefs of Buddhism boil down to this. Buddhists do not believe in God because we believe in man. Buddhist believes that all things that you need in life to achieve enlightenment, to achieve nirvana, can be found within your own mind. Why not? Siddhartha realized it. Siddhartha lived it. Siddhartha went and sat under the Bodhi tree until he figured it out, and then spent the rest of his life applying it. B, every person is precious and may attain Buddhahood. When you, depending on the tradition, there's actually several traditions of Buddhism, but the largest one in particular, called Mahayana Buddhism, which means the greater vehicle. It applies to the most people. They believe that when you reach nirvana, you actually become a Buddha. In fact, they actually celebrate certain people who they believe to be Buddhas. Now, because there's only the true Buddha, everyone else is sort of just a guesstimate. They have a name for it. It's called bodhisattvas. If you look through the scripture passages that we have from the Tripitaka, that word is actually in there. I won't spell it for you right now because I don't have it written down. and I would probably mess it up. Bodhisattvas are people who have reached nirvana. And in Buddhism, they do believe that when you reach nirvana, you are basically a Buddha yourself. See, no one can save us but ourselves. The Buddha is not a savior. The Buddha is just a smart person who figured it all out and sort of teaches us the correct way as much as he could in his lifetime. However, it is not him. Do you have a question?
How does someone know when a person reached nirvana?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I know you reach nirvana. All that matters is that you do. That's why they call them bodhisattvas and not Buddhas. They're really just guessing. You have to be dead, by the way. You can't be a bodhisattva and be living. Because obviously if you're living, if you're here, you're not in nirvana, right? So you can't be here anymore. But yeah, they're really just guessing. That's why they have a different name for it. And indeed, Buddha shows us the way. Buddha's the one that lit the path. Buddha's the one that long ago said, here it is. He sat under the tree with a question in mind. He wanted to know, what will it take to make me happy? And he came up with this. And an entire religion that has stood for 2,500 years or more exists because of that. Because one man said, I figured it out. And there are people every single day that follow that teaching that want to figure it out too. And the sad thing about Buddhism is they really never do. It was a good question to ask whether they know someone reached Buddhahood. You never do. You never really know. You can guess, but there's no assurance. You only know if you've reached nirvana if you're there, and no one else knows. So no one else can really say, this person figured it all out. They're pretty certain that Buddha did, but you can follow his instructions to the letter and still not quite get there. Exactly, and that's sort of the contradiction of Buddhism, is to reach nirvana is a desire, and so it would cause suffering in one's life. It's a big contradiction. Of course, you would have a Buddhist argue that while reaching nirvana is the goal, it is not a desire to get there. The desire is to remove all desires. Nirvana is just the result. Well, that's Buddhism. Next week, yes?
So the people that you mentioned earlier that are given sort of like a Buddha status by I guess, other people who practice the religion, those are people that have passed away and just looking back at their lives, they figure that they have reached some sort of level of Buddhahood?
Right. These would be monks who devoted most of their life to learning and teaching, and people look at their lives and say, they seem to have figured it out. It would be very similar to the idea of sainthood in the Catholic Church, where they look at somebody's life, and if anybody's not familiar, the idea of canonization of a person in the Catholic tradition is to basically say, we believe without a shadow of a doubt that that person is in heaven. That's almost what the title of a bodhisattva is in Buddhism. For next week, if you will read through, starting at page 90, and going until the next chapter starts, Travis has put in your textbook some excerpts from Buddhist scriptures from the Tripitaka. If you thought that Hinduism was strange, there are no stories. Well, there are stories, but there are no funny anecdotes of comical gods. There are no really crazy ideas of weird creation. There's a lot of simile and not a lot of analogy, but really it's just a lot of teaching. It's kind of dry. So work through it, read through it, make notes, see if you can show where some of these noble truths are found in their scriptures, because they'll really help later on. And come back next week with all your questions and ask Travis, because I have no idea. Okay? Thank you, guys.